All right, well, welcome everyone to the start of the conference and for the first panel. And thank you so much for making it here bright and early for a 9 a.m. start, almost 9 a.m. start. I'm Jasmine Ghani. I'll be chairing this panel, and I'll just be giving a very short introduction, putting things into context before we begin. The conference is titled International Relations in the Multipolar Middle East. We'll be running from today until Wednesday, and the whole idea came about because we had quite a few cancellations of other Middle East conferences and other IR conferences. So a few of us got together, decided to a bit experimentally to compensate for that. And so this has come together. I just want to say thank you to a few members from CPAD who have done a really sterling job to help with the logistical side. So Elias El-Rafai, Olivia Glombit's going to be taking care of the technical side of things. So a huge thanks to all three of you. Right, so today's panel, this morning's panel, quite imaginatively titled Regional Powers. And does fit in very well with the whole theme of it being a multipolar Middle East, reflecting the transition that's taken place ever since the Arab uprisings, really sort of destabilization of the normal politics and status quo that we were used to prior to the uprisings. And how does that sort of shaking of the kaleidoscope look like in terms of not just the regional states, but also non-state actors. So we have on this panel, and I'll just go through the running order, and hopefully we'll be able to follow that as well in terms of the presentations. Our first presenter will be Umer Karim. He's from the University of Birmingham, and he'll be presenting on ideological polarity and decision makers' perceptions, underbalancing in the Middle East, the case of Saudi-Turkish engagement after the Arab Spring. His paper will be followed by Aidan Parkes from the Australian National University, who'll be presenting on historical legacies and interstate order in the Middle East, competing perceptions of polarity. Third, we'll have Dylan Maguire from Northeastern University, who will be presenting a paper on agents of change, ideological selection preference in state-militia partnerships. And finally, we'll be finishing the presentations with James Dorsey from Nanyang National Panel, stretching from two sides of the globe, but he'll be presenting on turning Gulf security upside down. So each of the presenters will have 15 minutes to speak, and I will give you a heads up in the chat about 3 minutes from time and 1 minute from time. So for the presenters, please keep an eye out in the chat box, and then it'll be a pleasure to turn to the attendees for questions and answers afterwards. So if I can hand over now to Umer, if you're ready to present.
Sure. Yeah. Is it fine? Should I go on? Can everyone hear me? Okay, I will start then. So this presentation of mine, it's basically an attempt to unravel the Turkish-Saudi engagement, particularly after the Arab Spring, and also to use some theoretical tools to better understand this sort of what I would say a very complex engagement of within the political spectrum of Middle East. And I would be heavily relying upon two specific works, one of Hoss, which deals with the concept of ideological multipolarity, and of course a very good commentary on Hoss' work by Professor Gregory Gause, who has tried to situate the concept of ideological polarity within the Middle Eastern spectrum, and specifically in terms of a possible Saudi, Turkish and Israeli balancing behavior against Iran, and why has it not really happened. So my addition would be that the concept which Professor Gause says fits like a glove into the Middle Eastern political spectrum, we need to focus on certain other parameters when we are observing this particular relationship, or even when we are trying to apply the concept of ideological polarities to understand balancing. So first, I will just go through empirically and narrate some developments which have dictated the state of Saudi-Turkish relationship. Of course, it's a relationship which has specific historical baggage. The first Saudi state was effectively demolished or eliminated by the Ottoman interventions by the Ottoman viceroy in Egypt and his troops, particularly, not himself. And then, of course, the third Saudi state also rose from the very ashes of Ottoman presence within the Arabian Peninsula. So both of these political actors, of course, we can say in the historical sense, they have a particular political relationship, which is not, you can say, not very cordial, very competitive at times, but also has elements of you can say engagement, particularly a lot of some of the members of the Saudi royal house, they remain within Istanbul, and Princess Ifat, who later on became Queen Ifat, the wife of King Faisal, she also had spent her childhood and a good time of her life within Istanbul. So moving on to from this historical narration, I would say that Turkish-Saudi relationship it really moved on when to a new level when two developments happened within, of course, the 21st century. The first one was, of course, the US invasion of Iraq, which upended the regional political order and ended Iraq's stature as balancing power within the broader Middle Eastern spectrum against Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the other important development was the emergence of AKP into Turkish political spectrum. And for the first time, the Turkish political elite started engaging with the Middle Eastern side of their political geography. And this started to develop a nascent relationship with the broader GCC countries, but also particularly between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. At one point, it was so good that the GCC states were actively discussing strategic relationship with Turkey. There was a comprehensive strategic dialogue between GCC states and Turkey, and the general sense within the GCC was that Turkey could be considered a replacement in terms of regional balancing, specifically when Iraq is no more there. So this was the sort of goodwill which played out in the first decade of the 21st century. The personal ties, of course, between the Saudi royals and the Turkish president remained very good. Okay, is it good? Okay, so the personal ties between the Saudi royals and the Turkish president, they were quite good. President Erdogan was given the King Faisal Prize, which is considered quite a prestigious one, and which from where he is now, it looks quite extraordinary as well. And of course, on the Turkish side, the foreign policy generally was of the zero problems approach with the Turkish neighbors. Of course, the main architect of that foreign policy was the Turkish foreign minister of that time, and later on Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu. The Arab Spring effectively started the process which would eventually change the very contours of Turkish-Saudi relationship. Of course, we saw Turkey re-evaluating its regional role, and the zero problems approach changed to a more assertive approach, where Turkey could eventually see an opportunity to sell its democratic model, a model in which uh, agents of religion can politically achieve power and represent people. And this model did indeed inspire uh, political mobilization within different countries of the region. Within certain agents, of course, other agents were inspired by other ideological facets. While on the other hand, Saudi Arabia emerged as the status quo power within the Middle East, and the fall of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was a big blow for Saudi Arabia. And this was, you can say that this started to put both sides on a path which would eventually, which would eventually lead them towards a contestation of political space within the broader Middle Eastern political order. But still, since Iran also played as an aggressive political power at that time and actively tried to, of course, it tried to contain, it tried to maintain the political capital it had achieved across the Middle East. And of course, it saw a threat coming from these nascent political mobilizations towards that sort of political order. So there was naturally, in the structuralist sense, an incentive for Saudi Arabia as well as Turkey to collaborate and to work together. And we see them working together, particularly in Syria, where both states, although they supported different elements, but they agreed upon the removal of the President Bashar al-Assad and limitation of Iranian influence or Iranian presence. Then changes started happening within the domestic sphere of both countries. In Turkey, of course, we saw the Ghazi protest movement, which proved to be quite a challenge for the government. And since by that time, the Egyptian government of President Morsi was also removed through a coup attempt by General Sisi. So Turkey found itself politically isolated, which which an advisor of the Turkish Prime Minister of that time, Ibrahim Kalin, I think he phrased it as precious loneliness. Of course, there were also internal divisions within the AKP, and which eventually resulted in the departure of the Prime Minister of that time, Ahmet Davutoglu. And then the Russian intervention in Syria, it finally tipped the scales in favor of President Bashar al-Assad. So the very structural incentive, which was keeping both Saudi Arabia and Turkey together in this broader scheme of affairs, had gone. Of course, afterwards, the coup attempt in Turkey led to a complete recalibration of the political spectrum and regime security, threats towards the regime, and which are the actors posing those specific threats. They became paramount rather than a desire to balance against Iran. And I will even say that the whole balancing game changed to some extent. And then the Gulf crisis, Turkey's support for Qatar, and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi heightened that tension. Within the Saudi sphere, some of the episodes are same. The Saudis' position on Syria changed when Prince Bandar was moved as the intelligence chief, and the Syrian file was given to Prince, at that time, Interior Minister Mohammed bin Naif. And of course, there was a little patch of renewed engagement when King Salman ascended the throne, and this is why I would explain why it's important to theoretically explain or to theoretically deconstruct this development. And of course, in the Gulf crisis and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the regime security factor again became a prominent factor in the Saudi, from a Saudi perspective, and the structural incentives to balance against Iran, they were put on a, they, they gradually gone a bit back. So eventually the question remains, why Turkey and Saudi Arabia, when it really suits them to limit Iranian influence within the region, why haven't been they able to do so? And while we have discussed this, how can we actually rephrase it in theoretical terms? So in theoretical terms, I would say that there are that Hawes's theory is quite interesting, because he thinks that um, there are, if there is ideological bipolarity, that two actors who can be structurally partners against a third actor, if they are ideologically similar, or at least the difference is along one plane, then they would collaborate in this structural partnership. But if the ideologies of their decision makers, or what he says, the translation of those ideologies into systems of governance or systems or political institutions, if they differ, then we would see uh, either underbalancing or a balancing behavior which is inefficient. Professor Gregory Gause has termed it as the conceptualizing of ruling elites' identity as a structural element in the international political system. And what we can say is that ideology, it does has a it does involve itself and structures the international system. So this influx of ideology, it has actually an effect on how the structural notions within the system of international of system of international order, how it behaves. And we can further on go from this and say that the problem then becomes if an individual leader, he or she prioritizes regime security and a threat from towards that particular regime, which is coming from a supposedly structuralist ally, or he will ignore that threat because of his or her personal disposition towards the other actor, and rather go for a structuralist balancing against their joint structuralist foe. So this is the sort of balance, and I coin two terms that once that we are focusing on ideological multipolarities, that once they are there, actors will rather go for the threat towards their regimes, which actually may arise from their systemic partners. But there is also a concept or a term which I have myself tried to coin, of structural congruity. So it is the decision makers. It's upon the decision maker to decide between ideological multipolarity or structural congruity. Structural congruity basically gives us an idea of if the regime security can be deprioritized on the structural incentives which are there, and if the individual decision maker thinks that the threat towards regime security is far less than the possible incentives which I can get by shaking hands with with my structuralist partner. And I think in the Saudi case, Saudi-Turkish case, this has been happening, and that's why when the decision makers change, with King Salman coming up, we see a renewed partnership, and then again, with the prominence of Mohammed bin Salman, and as the distance amongst both of these leaders, it grows, we see both going for regime security dynamic, and of course the episodes of Qatar Gulf crisis of 2017, the Saudi and Turkish choices, and the second episode of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. It gives us a good idea of which factor is being at play. And I would then go on and say, to conclude, that once any of the two rulers within Saudi Arabia or within Turkey, they change, the new ruler would again give equal weightage to the structuralist factor rather than the ideological multipolarity induced regime security factor. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Umer. And that's exactly on time, which is very good. Can we hand over to Aidan? Aidan, you're here, I think. So I'll just pass on. Great. And your presentation is, just as a reminder, historical legacies and interstate order in the Middle East, competing perceptions of polarity.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. And thanks so much for having me, everyone. Am I able to put my PowerPoint on share screen?
I think Elias should be able to sort that out for you. I think
you should be able to. You have the share screen button at the bottom.
It says host is disabled, attendee screen sharing.
Let me see, just 1 second. Okay, try it now.
Ah, cool. Okay. So thanks so much for the kind introduction, for inviting me today to the panel. I'd like to start by saying that after studying international security theory in Australia during the rise of China over the past 5 years, the end of US unipolarity and the decay of its liberal rules-based order has become more of an intellectual burden and a sovereign concern than one of any specific personal intellectual interest. Nonetheless, today I want to talk about some competing perceptions of polarity in the Middle East and how this state-centric paradigm might limit the way we think about the nature of order and hegemony in a region free from external superpower interference. In the history of IR theory, multipolarity denotes two or more states contesting dominance of the international system. Modern IR history locates three phases of polarity with the exact end date of unipolarity typically contested. Across these three phases, though, the British-centered 19th century and the American-centered 20th century produced two phases of rapid but vastly unequal phases of global modernization. Under both periods, the existence of imperial hegemony structurally inhibited the Middle East system and contributed to the artificiality of the region's state formation, and also to the implied normalization that fragile and failed states can actually exist in a multipolar system. These two projects of modernity limited the agency and identity of the Middle East system. Given the prevalence of failed states without clear regional ordering in the system, a defined regional multipolar order is not convincingly apparent. Somewhere between the 2011 Arab uprisings and the beginning of the Syrian civil war, the Middle East system looked to be in a period of power transition preceding a likely scenario that will become multipolarity. This slide depicts how unipolarity reflects the ideal type of international order. A crucial distinction to be made is the difference between pre-modern multipolarity and what Flockhart terms as the multi-order system. So the multipolarity that we're talking about in 2020 is vastly different from the multipolarity that theorists discussed before the Cold War. The consequences of global modernity and the unequal distribution of wealth meant that even under various periods of systemic polarity, global modernity was still driven by the British Empire in the 19th century and American liberal hegemony throughout the 20th century. I draw on Buzan and Lawson's decentered globalism thesis, and I've listed three of their key macro implications of the coming world order, and also added a normative regional element for this conference. The English school middle way theoretically accepts the existence and influence of great powers driving the nature of the system, while also accepting distinct features such as perception and culture. A useful implication the ES offers is the condition of global non-hegemony. Throughout history, several varieties of global hegemony structurally limited the agency of transnational and collective identities in the Middle East. This is typically manifested through divide and rule tactics with great powers, installing authoritarian regimes and suppressing radical nationalism and pan-Islamism. The former method assured the economic architecture of Western hegemony, and the latter ensured systemic conformity of the system and the marginalization of dissenting voices. The implication of enhanced role of regionalism is the driving variable of this paper. So understanding order and hegemony is an important question for IR scholars. Evelyn Goh offers a useful canvas for thinking about the normative dynamics at play when considering regional order in East Asia. And I think this is one of the best contributions to the English school that can't be considered Eurocentric in a way. Goh presents a conceptualization of layered hierarchical order in East Asia since the end of the Cold War. This conceptualization presents hegemony as one form of hierarchy, but Goh stresses the Gramscian notion of hegemony, acknowledging coercion and constraint, rather than a classical realist understanding of hegemony. The social dynamics of a layered hierarchical order offer a more insightful depiction of how the regional system is maintained through complex alliance structures and also social status, rather than adopting a binary conception of status quo / revisionist predispositions to the international system or to a regional system in the future. So developing the notion of Gramscian hegemony within regional order, these two dimensions are abstracted to factor imperial hegemony in the Middle East hierarchical order. Imperial hegemony, often attributed to penetrating the international system, also structurally affected the nature of hierarchical order. The British and French division and spheres of influence in the Middle East imposed a seemingly intractable feature of imperial hegemony in the regional system. The Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882 affirmed British global hegemony, resulting in the British occupation of Egypt for 7 decades, with the Ottoman Empire retaining nominal ownership until 1914. Describing the geopolitical significance of the event, historian A.J.P. Taylor wrote that it was a great event indeed, the only real event in international relations between the 1870 Battle of Sedan and the defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Taylor emphasized the long-term impact by saying that the British occupation of Egypt altered the balance of power. It not only gave the British security for their route to India, it made them masters of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. It made it unnecessary for them to stand in the front lines against Russia at the Straits, and thus prepared the way forward for the Franco-Russian alliance 10 years later. Hegemonic penetration continued during the Cold War and only amplified during Washington's quest for global hegemony. The creation of Israel and its evolution into a potential regional hegemon throughout the Cold War and during US preponderance fundamentally changed the regional balance of power. Being the only state with a nuclear deterrent, Israel successfully contested interstate order through the institution of war, while also benefiting from assurances of the liberal hegemonic order. While philosophically conceived as counter-hegemonic, the Islamic Republic of Iran was soon framed by many in the region as an actor with legitimate regional hegemonic ambitions. Aligned with Western hegemony, Saudi Arabia sought regional hegemony through the GCC institution and as a means of isolating Iran. Turkey's conception of polarity and its position in regional order has oscillated in tandem with the development of its national identity. I apply 2 additional sub-state dimensions to hegemony and hierarchical order in the Middle East. A variety of non-state and transnational actors arguably affect order in the Middle East in equal measure to small states. One example of this is the influence of Hezbollah in affecting the regional balance of power during the Cold War. The stipulative scenario depicts regional hierarchical order under hegemony with social classifications relating to the structure of international order. So what does order look like in the region after global hegemony? The salience of transnational actors, transnational identities, and the intervening variable of great power inflection collectively destabilizes the notion that we can accurately measure regional polarity through a state-centric lens, particularly in light of a global power transition. The granular line adds a stipulative perceptual layer to order, because immaterial power is particularly salient in the social structures of the Middle East system. Transnational actors, therefore, have an enhanced degree of agency. An illuminating theoretical implication of the research depicted is that global non-hegemony creates space for states to realistically contemplate regional hegemony. However, if states do not share the same strategic rationale, discrepant conceptions of regional polarity invariably emerge. Did US unipolarity facilitate the modern nuclear unit of Israel, which would top a classical realist regional hierarchical order in the Middle East? It is undeniable that Salafi Wahhabi ideals conflict with Twelver Shiism's claims of a returning imamate. However, this geostrategic dynamism is further complicated by incongruent alliance structures. Saudi Arabia is doubling down its complicity by assuring status quo US dominance and also aligning itself with Israel. In contrast, Iran aligns itself with Russia and fosters a network of non-state Shia actors equipped with exerting influence and affecting dynamics in the region. Some identity-influenced states are more fertile to seeking Gramscian hegemony than others. Israel, for instance, likely possesses the material requirements to world regional hegemony. However, due to the condition of global non-hegemony and the anti-hegemonistic attitudes emblematic of the Middle East, Iran's Shia axis of resistance represents a stronger case for neo-Gramscian hegemony through the instrumentalization of Islam than Israel's traditional power parity dominance. If one accepts that Hezbollah and the IRGC and its affiliates affect regional order in the Middle East, it is difficult to contemplate a Middle Eastern hierarchical order or systemic polarity in the region for that matter, comprising only of nation states. In sum, the absence of global hegemony fosters a more pluralistic hierarchical order. What's most striking about these states is not that they can conceivably assume hegemony in such a variety of ways. Rather, in many ways, the unique artificial construction of national identity and the fluidity of this process requires a legitimate claim to hegemony to exist in historical legacy. This is not simply to say the past legitimizes the actions of the present, but unique historical legacies of oppression and emancipation limit the extent to which national identity is malleable to hegemonic ideals. Regional hegemony is not only more attainable to some states, in some cases it is more ideologically desirable. If hegemony is more desirable to some states than others, and perceptions of polarity and power are varied, does the imposition of state-centric multipolarity suit the normative and deeply fluid nature of order in the Middle East? Simply put, regional hegemony in the Middle East system is not necessarily a position exclusive to states. Having outlined some of the perceptual issues regarding hegemony, the polysemic nature of polarity, and the salience of supernatural identities in the Middle East, polarity in the Middle East can be understood through the ES tripartite method, but locates more closely with a realist constructionist blend that synthesizes critical security studies and critical race studies. The basic premise holds that regional polarity is culturally contextualized and reconstructed. If order in the Middle East is socially constructed at a regional level, it is not hyperbolic to suggest that in the case of Iran, its perceptions of systemic order and its place in interstate order is determined in large part by Islamic ideals. Realists would need little convincing that Iran seeks regional hegemony. In contrast, liberals might argue along some lines of cooperation, coexistence, and global economic integration. However, both conceptions lose sight of the importance of perceiving hegemony. As much as top-down factors influence the way we think about polarity and regional powers, substate factors affect the conventional state. Substate factors challenge the conventional state-centric paradigm of hegemony and order in the region. English school scholars have attempted to address regional society in the Middle East. Buzan and Gonzalez-Pelaez provide a comprehensive overview of ES theory at a regional level, and I must say this is not the most recent study, but just one that I'm using as a theoretical framework. And they present a unique enterprise to address the Western-centric critiques of regional society. In suit with the normative precepts of the Middle East, Buzan proposes at a regional level the replacement of the international system, society, and world society with interstate society, transnational society, and interhuman society. Buzan equates the interstate society to international society, while fusing the transnational and interhuman domains to demonstrate what he terms a whole pattern of a large-scale social structure. The overlap in Buzan's categorizations highlights both the English school's limited examination of the Middle East, but also the potential strengths in conceptualizing the material and ideational factors at play contributing to social structures and regional hierarchical order. Buzan writes that for the Middle East, the future of regional society might best be understood through the intersubjective institution of the Ummah, as it best resembles the features of social structures guided by shared beliefs, understandings, and norms. However, this conception of the Ummah as a regional institution tacitly treats Islam as a monolith. Treating Islam as a monolith overlooks the complex divisions within Islam, and in doing so, dismisses the increasingly distinct vector of transnational collective Shia identity and the existence of an Ummah within regional society in the Middle East. The condition of global non-hegemony enhances transnational Shiism as a social movement rather than Iran as a state per se. Transnational Shiism in the Middle East aligns with Buzan's institutions of collective identity in the interhuman domain and advocacy in the transnational domain. Given the enhanced role of regionalism, the notion of the Ummah as a regional international society in the Middle East is a useful step for more critical variants of ES thought. And Ummah within, as it relates to the Shia minority within Islam, would indicate some degree of shared norms, beliefs, and understandings. Socially reminiscent of Anderson's imagined communities, transnational Shiism produces purpose and collective identity. In addition to the state-centric material features of transnational Shiism advanced by Iran, Shia shrine cities possess spatial material power through the collection and distribution of religious taxes such as zakat and khums, and also the educational hawza institutions, which facilitate advocacy in the transnational domain. The reproduction of collective identity in shrine cities also represents the immaterial power of transnational Shiism in the interhuman domain. Accepting a normative return to regionalism, this graphic illustrates how primary institutions, not necessarily of Western institutional texture, exist and can be found through a normative, grand historical approach to understanding regional society in the Middle East. Fundamentally, international society in the ES tradition was designed to explain order exists under anarchy. The empirical roots of the notion are state-centric, and English school is indeed Eurocentric. However, the tripartite ontology itself still holds applicability to the Middle East. Squaring the evolution of the Middle East system with the British and American centuries offers a clearer depiction of the factors contributing to the emerging multipolar Middle East that we talk about today. Colonial interference across these centuries in the Middle East was particularly problematic in regards to the construction of nation states, and also contributed to the emergence of two key features of the modern Middle East: transnational Islamic ideologies and the broad rejection of hegemony of all forms. Accepting that through the vastly unequal core periphery periods, the meaner nation states were structurally curbed by hegemony, the condition of global non-hegemony denotes the enhanced role of regionalism. Furthermore, the implications of a multipolar Middle East are less illuminating than the implications of a Middle East system devoid of hegemonic influence. The former is theoretically subjective and problematically state-centric. The latter offers a new epistemological focus without sacrificing the classical axioms of ES thought, such as order under anarchy and society among communities. Scholars of the Middle East rightly avoid imposing robust IR theoretical frameworks, opting instead for analytical eclecticism. A cohort of prolific MENA scholars have continued the work of Halliday and Hinderbush and many others who are here today, in understanding the complex nature of the politics and society of the region. When we as IR scholars describe the nature of power in the Middle East and the imposition of multipolarity, it carries a sense of continental state-centric securitization. After 2 centuries of Western hegemonic interference in the regional system and the nascent emergence of global multipolarity, the analytical focal point of polarity is no longer isolated to states. Thinking about the diffuse power distribution characterizing the Middle East, the key shift is not the quantitative number of powers, but rather the qualitative transformation creating space for new modes of power and hegemonic forces beyond states. I would like to acknowledge and thank Jim Piscatori for challenging me to look beyond securitization and geopolitics when thinking about the dynamics of the Middle East and the constructedness of orders regionally and everywhere. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Aidan.
Approach and look more at current trends and what they may lead to. Like many paradigms across the globe, the pandemic and its associated economic downturn have changed the paradigm, shaping debates about Gulf security that was set to gradually migrate from a unipolar US defense umbrella that shielded energy-rich monarchies against Iran to an architecture that was more multilateral. In many ways, the pandemic's fallout has leveled the playing field, and not necessarily in ways that favor current policies of Gulf states. Saudi Arabia's relations with the West are increasingly being called into question, with the Saudi-Russian oil price war in March potentially having broken the camel's back. The Kingdom and the United Arab Emirates stand to lose at least some of the financial clout that allowed them to punch above their weight, even if they are likely to exclude arms purchases from their austerity measures. Weakened financial clout comes at a moment that the Gulf states and Iran are gearing up towards an arms race in the wake of Iran's recent satellite launch and unveiling an unmanned underwater vehicle against the backdrop of the 2015 international agreement that curbed the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, inching towards collapse. The unmanned underwater vehicle puts Iran in an elite club, of which the only other members capable of producing them are the United States, Britain, and China. The satellite adds Iran to a group of only about a dozen countries able to do launches of their own. Add to this that none of the regional players, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, feel secure that any of the external powers, the United States, China, and Russia, are reliable security and geopolitical partners. Gulf states have for years, going back to the era of Barack Obama, increasingly perceived the United States as unfortunately their only option on the premise that they are not willing to change their own policies, particularly towards Iran, but one that is demonstrably unreliable, unwilling to defend Gulf states at whatever cost, and at times at odds with them in terms of policy objectives. The Gulf states' problem is that neither Russia or China offer real alternatives, at least not on terms all Gulf states are willing to accept. Russia is neither interested nor capable of replacing the United States. Moreover, its Gulf security plan is at odds with at least the policy of Saudi Arabia. The plan calls for a security arrangement modeled on that of Europe under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE. It would be an arrangement that, unlike the US defense umbrella in the Gulf, includes Iran, not directed against it. It would have to involve some kind of regional agreement on non-aggression. Saudi Arabia, under Mohammed bin Salman, has made clear that it is not interested, as evident in the pandemic, where it has refrained, in contrast to other Gulf states, from reaching out to Iran with humanitarian help aid, and even though it last year engaged in an indirect exchange with the Islamic Republic. That exchange died with the killing of the United States in January of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. China is obviously the elephant in the room. Logically, China and the Gulf states are in the same boat as they grapple with uncertainty about current regional security arrangements. Like the Gulf states, China has long relied on the US defense umbrella to ensure the security of the flow of energy and other goods through waters surrounding the Gulf, in what the United States has termed free riding. In anticipation of the day when China can no longer depend on security provided by the United States free of charge, China has gradually adjusted its defense strategy and built its first foreign military facility in Djibouti, facing the Gulf from the Horn of Africa. With the People's Liberation Army Navy tasked with protecting China's sea lines of communication and safeguarding its overseas interests, strategic planners have signaled that Djibouti is a first step in the likely establishment of further bases that would allow to project long-range capability and shorten the time needed to resupply. But, like with Russians, Chinese strategic planners and their Gulf counterparts may part ways when it comes to what would be acceptable geopolitical parameters for a rejuvenated regional security architecture, particularly with regard to Iran. Any new architecture would break the mold of Chinese engagement in the Middle East that is designed to shield the People's Republic from being sucked into the region's myriad conflicts. The assumption has long been that China could at best postpone execution, that ultimately it would have no choice but to engage in the politics of the region. More recently, influential Chinese analysts are suggesting that China has another option: turn its back on the region. That may seem incredulous, given China's dependence on Middle Eastern energy resources, as well as its significant investments in the region. These analysts note, however, that China is able to diversify its energy sources and that Chinese investment in the Middle East is but a small percentage of overall Chinese overseas investment. They describe Chinese Middle Eastern economic relations as past their heyday, with economies of both in decline, and the prospects of the situation in the Middle East getting worse before it becomes better. To be sure, Chinese officials and analysts have consistently maintained that the Middle East is not a Chinese priority, that any future battles with the United States will be fought in the Asia Pacific, not in the Gulf. Their assertions are backed by the fact that China has yet to articulate a comprehensive policy towards the region, and in 2016 issued its one and only white paper on policy towards the Arab world, that essentially was an elaboration of its basic foreign and defense policy principles. More likely than China seriously entertaining turning its back on the Middle East is the probability that it is sending the region a message that is not dissimilar from what Russia is saying. Get your act together and find a way to dial down the tension. It is a message that appears to varying degrees to have been heard in the smaller Gulf states, but has yet to resonate in Riyadh. It is also a message that has not been rejected out of hand by Iran. How all of this may shake out could be determined by the emerging tug of war in the Middle East between China and the US. Israel has already been caught up in it and has made its choice clear, even if it is still attempting to maintain some wiggle room. Nonetheless, Israel, in the ultimate analysis, knows where its bread is buttered. States is the only backer of Israel's annexationist policies. In contrast to Israel, the US is likely to find the going tougher when it comes to persuading Gulf states to limit their engagement with China, including with telecom giant Huawei, which already has significant operations in the region. Like Israel, UAE officials have sought to convey to the US that they see relations with the United States as indispensable, even though that has yet to be put to a test when it comes to China. Gulf officials stress on the importance of ties with the US will, however, not shield them from US demands that they review and limit their relations with China, and warnings that involvement of Huawei could jeopardize sensitive communications, particularly given the multiple US bases in the region, including the US Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and the forward headquarters of the US Military Central Command, or CENTCOM, in Qatar. The US Embassy in Abu Dhabi, in a shot across the Gulf's bow, last month rejected a UAE offer to donate hundreds of coronavirus tests for screening of its staff. The snub was designed to put a dent in China's health Silk Road diplomacy, centered on its experience with the pandemic and ability to manufacture personal protective and medical equipment. A US official said the tests were rejected because they were either Chinese-made or involved BGI, a Chinese genomics company active in the Gulf, which raised concerns about patient privacy. The US softened the blow when the prestigious Ohio-based Cleveland Clinic sent 40 nurses and doctors to its Abu Dhabi subsidiary. The Abu Dhabi facility was tasked with treating the UAE's most severe cases of coronavirus. The problem for the US is that it is not only Trump's policy, or lack thereof, towards the Middle East that undermines confidence. It's also policies that on the surface have nothing to do with the Middle East. The United States has been asking its partners, including Gulf states, to give it time to develop an alternative to Huawei's 5G network. Yet at the same time, it is barring the kind of people entry that technology companies need to develop systems. No matter how the tug of war in the Middle East evolves, the silver lining is that, like China, the United States, despite its desire to reduce its commitment, cannot afford a power void in the region. That is what may create the basis for breaking the mold. It will require a backing away from approaches that treat conflicts as zero-sum games, not only on the part of regional players, but also of external players, like in the case of the US versus Iran. And it will require engagement by all regional players. To achieve that, regional and external players would have to recognize that in many ways, perceptions on both sides of the Gulf are mirrored images of one another's. All parties see each other as existential threats. Failure to break the stalemate risks conflicts becoming further entrenched and threatening to spin out of control. The opportunity is that confidence-building measures and a willingness to engage open a door towards mutually acceptable regional security arrangement and conflict resolution. However, for that to happen, major powers will have to invest political will and energy at a time that they feel that they have bigger fish to fry and prioritize geopolitical jockeying. In a twist of irony, geopolitical jockeying may prove to be an icebreaker in a world, and certainly a region, where everything is interconnected. Increasingly, security in the Gulf is not just about security in the Gulf. It is not even just about security in the Middle East. It is about security in the Mediterranean. Whether one looks at Libya on the sea's southern shores, Syria in the east, or growing tension in the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. And it doesn't stop there, with regional rivalries reaching into the Black and Caspian Seas and into Central Asia. Finally, there are the gray and black swans built into partnerships and alliances that are either becoming more fragile, like those of the United States, or ones that have fragility built into their DNA, like the ties between Iran, Turkey, China, and Russia. Those swans could at any moment swing the pendulum one way or another. To be sure, contrary to Western perceptions, relations between Iran, Turkey, Russia, and China are not just opportunistic and driven by short-term common interests, but also grounded in a degree of shared values. The fact of the matter is that men like Presidents Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei find common ground in view of a new world order that rejects democracy and the rule of law, disregards human and minority rights, flunks, at least for now, violations of international law, and operates on the principle, however, is insufficient to prevent Turkey and Russia from ending up on opposite sides of conflicts in Libya and Syria. It is also unlikely to halt the gradual erosion of a presumed division of labor in Central Asia, with Russia ensuring security and China focusing on economic development. And it is doubtful it would alter the simmering rivalry between Iran and Russia in the Caspian Sea, and long-standing Russian reluctance to sell Iran a badly needed anti-missile defense system. In short, fasten your seatbelt. Gulf and broader regional security could prove to be a bumpy ride with unexpected speed bumps. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks so much, James. And we got there in the end, I think. Yes, and Dylan, are you ready with your presentation?
Okay, let's try one more time.
Do we have a PowerPoint? The agents of change, ideological selection, preference, and state militia partnerships, and we can see your PowerPoint. So that's
awesome. Okay. Of technical difficulties, I'm in business. So, my name is Dylan Maguire, and the title of my talk is Agents of Change, Ideological Selection, Preference, and State Militia Partnerships. So, why we're all here today is to talk about multipolarity in the Middle East. So, two of the main poles in that multipolar system are Israel and Iran. And both of these countries have pursued state alliances in the region and outside of the region, but both of these states have also pursued alliances with non-state actors. So Israel's non-state commonly been called the minority alliances, or alliances of the periphery, where they chose actors that they thought could help them balance against Arab nationalists. Whereas Iran's sort of non-state actor alliance has been called the axis of resistance, right? So it famously involves Hezbollah, Ansar al-Sharia, and also Syria, its main state partner. So the research question that I'm looking at is, why has Iran been far more successful than Israel in building durable state militia partnerships? So I'm referring to these non-state actors as militias. So Iran has been more successful. Israel has famously failed. And sort of the conventional wisdom for answering this question leads to identity-based politics, right? So the Jewish nature of Israel as a state leads it to have little allies in the region, and because it is always fearful of its minority status as a Jewish nation surrounded by enemies, it can never really trust anybody else. Conversely, Iran counts as its Shia Islamic power, its status as a religious leader, to give it the ability to make and keep these types of alliances. So this conventional wisdom breaks down a little bit when Iran is doing business with Hamas or other Palestinian groups, because obviously they're not Shia, but still sort of the conventional wisdom says that Islam provides this, this bridge. So conversely, I'm arguing for ideology as the main explanatory mechanism for which to describe the success of Iran and the failure of Israel. So I define ideology as a program of collective action for the maintenance, alteration, or transformation of society, right? And this really makes me think of sort of the famous status quo revisionist literature started off by Morgenthau, but later picked up again by Schweller, that talks about what states want out of a system, whether they have anti-systemic frames or pro-systemic frames. So change in the system to try to alter the system, to try to make it better for oneself would make one a revisionist power, whereas trying to support the status quo, balance of power, make one a status quo power. So this ideological mechanism plays out something like this in the way that I'm talking about these partnerships between states and militias. So on the left, you have at the state level, and on the right, you have at the organizational militia level. And within these two types of organizations, within the state and within the militia, there are those who support the status quo and those who are more revisionist. And when the status quo supporters in the state and the status quo supporters in a militia are both dominant in those organizations, and those two organizations share a threat perception, share some common threat, then a partnership can take place. Similarly, if revisionists in the state and revisionists in a militia also share a threat perception, then a partnership can take place. So this is my hypothesis. So there's two main variables that are interacting here in order to produce the explanation that I'm trying to look for. So the first one is a threat perception, right? So there has to be a common threat for this alliance, this partnership to take place. So that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for my theory, right? The main acting variable here is ideological congruence, right? That status quo or revisionist binary variable. So if the revisionist or status quo ideological congruence co-vary over long periods of time, over changes between the state and the militia, then I would say that you have an enduring partnership, right? A partnership that can go the length. Whereas if those ideological congruences vary independently between the state and the militia, then you'll have a tactical partnership, really, like it'll be sort of one-off partnerships. So these are sort of the predicted outcomes from my theory. And the representative cases I find for an enduring partnership are Iran and Hezbollah, like a lot of my colleagues have talked about this morning. Whereas examples of more tactical partnerships are Israel's relationships with successive Christian militias in Lebanon. So Kataib and then the sort of Lebanese forces offshoot from Kataib. So these are the cases that I'll be talking about. So my research design, just briefly, is obviously comparative case studies where I chose Hezbollah, Kataib, and Lebanese forces. And I'm really looking at armed political parties, right? So not just like what some people would call terrorists, but really political parties that use violence, but have the ability to govern territory, that governance is something that is meaningful to them. And I selected these partnership with Iran and Israel, because that's what I'm interested in talking about, but also the institutionalized, elite-driven decision-making processes of these political parties, right? So they're hierarchical, they're able to make and break agreements internationally, and there's also variation in sort of what they want over time, so that security preferences. Okay, so my findings. So I broke up these two relationships into two time periods that really, I think, highlight this explanatory mechanism that I'm talking about. So I'm going to start with Israel. So from the start of the founding of Israel, right? So this was a huge change in Middle Eastern politics, right? And once Israel had established their state, they wanted to maintain that status quo. They wanted to maintain Israel as a state, and therefore they sought alliances throughout the region to better sustain that status quo. So one alliance that they looked for was this minority alliance in Lebanon, and they first started with a treaty with the Maronite Church in 1946 that really didn't go anywhere because the church didn't have the ability to enforce this type of agreement. But the Israelis quickly found Kataib, which was a Lebanese Christian political party that also had a very powerful militia that they started to develop relations with over the course of the 50s and 60s. Kataib actually really made a name for itself in the first civil war in Lebanon in 1958, where it was able to sort of hold the status quo, which it was interested in sustaining in Lebanon. After all, the Maronites in Lebanon during that time period had a very good slice of the political pie that they wanted to maintain. However, this period, this status quo preference period on both Kataib and Israel's part came to change in 1977 when Menachem Begin was elected to the premiership in Israel. And he brought a more revisionist, religiously revisionist ideology to Israeli politics. This was also coupled with the Camp David Accords, which happened in 1978, which really made the security situation much more favorable to Israel, as it took Egypt off the sort of the game board and made the Israelis able to concentrate farther north to Syria and Lebanon. At the same time, a more militant faction within Kataib, led by Bashir Gemayel, started to take hold, and his Lebanese forces group sort of grew out of Kataib and really sought to advance a very hard Christian nationalism in Lebanon that really moved the goalpost from what Kataib was trying to do, which was status quo maintenance of the current Maronite position, whereas Bashir Gemayel was trying to really change that position and grow his slice of the political pie. So Begin and Gemayel joined forces, and the Israelis invaded in 1982 and nearly overthrew the country and put Gemayel in power, but he was quickly killed. And nonetheless, the Israelis and this faction of Lebanese politics signed a peace agreement that was then quickly abrogated by the Lebanese forces and their Kataib political partners. The reason for this is because Lebanese forces and Kataib did not have the political clout to enforce the peace agreement that had been made. They were not able to accept this larger piece of the political pie because Lebanon was not Christian like the Israelis thought, was not amenable to that type of relationship. So therefore, this revisionist, this short tactical revisionist inspired partnership quickly fell apart when the Israelis were not able to achieve what they wanted to because the Lebanese forces were not able to deliver. Periods flip. So the first period, which is when there's more revisionist preferences, start really at the beginning of the Islamic Republic, when the revolution happens. And ideologically, the revolution was a mix of leftist liberation ideology and then much more conservative, clerical joining of political and religious forces in the religious innovation that was the Islamic Republic. At the same time, in Lebanon, you had Amal come to power, which was again or not come to power, but you had Amal emerge, which was a liberation theology inspired movement to try to bring Shia up from the peasantry and into power, or into a share of power in Lebanon. So you had a Shia Lebanese Amal inspired group trying to change the dynamics in Lebanon. At the same time, you had the export of the revolution, this liberation ideology, liberation theology in Iran that was really trying to change the system, trying to export the Islamic State, which was not the Islamic State we talk about now, but the Islamic State of Iran. The person who really led this charge in Iran was Montazeri, who was named Khomeini's successor designate in the early 80s. And quickly after that, Hezbollah formed out of Islamic Amal, but shared their dream of Amal's dream of really changing changing Lebanon for Shia. But Hezbollah took this one step further. They didn't only just want to work within the system; they wanted to overthrow the system to make an Islamic State in Lebanon. However, in the sort of the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a change in the sort of political currents in Iran. That liberation ideology sort of took the back burner to the more clerical currents in Iranian politics. And this sort of manifested itself in Montazeri being deposed in 1989 by Khomeini right before he dies. And Khomeini sort of blessing the rise of Khamenei and Rafsanjani, who were then quickly elected after Khomeini's death. At the same time, in Lebanon, Hezbollah does a good job of fighting the Israelis, but realizes that its market share, so to speak, in Lebanon has a threshold. And this they quickly realize at the Taif Accords, which they don't recognize, but which they see as an agreement in Lebanese politics, that the balance of power, the balance of confessional groups in Lebanon really has not changed that much. And after a complicated internal dynamic within Hezbollah that goes through the leadership changing over and over and over again, Hezbollah decides that rather than overthrow the Lebanese state and overthrow the Lebanese system to try to create an Islamic state, they're actually going to participate in Lebanese parliamentary elections in 1992. So again, they were founded on a revisionist ideology, but then accommodated themselves to the very system that they were trying to overthrow, much like Iran did when they were trying to change the international system, change the regional system, and then quickly accommodated themselves to that same system. So why should we care? I think that states building sustainable partnerships with militias is a fact of life in the current climate in the Middle East. And if states are interested in developing partnerships that are sustainable, they really need to have more informed assessments of the facts on the ground. So the Israelis, the reason that they trusted that the Lebanese forces could deliver on their promises was that they thought that Lebanon was a Christian country, and it's not. And therefore, the Israelis failed to understand the real facts on the ground, waded into a war that they weren't going to be able to finish, and then were left hanging when their Lebanese Christian partners decided that they could get a better deal from a different state. The other thing that this leaves me with is that militias have agency even in international relations. So despite the vast power disparities between states and militias, militias still can make and break alliances with states. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. And thanks also for sharing your PowerPoint. It was worth it. It was worth the wait. And I want to thank all of our presenters, really interesting papers. And we don't officially have a discussant for our panels, but I'll offer some quite short reflections, maybe a couple of questions. But in the meantime, would really welcome questions from the attendees, from the audience. And so what I'd suggest is that if you do have questions, please, if you could type them into the chat box and mention who your question is directed at. And then what I'll be able to do is come to you in the order of that the questions came in. So hopefully me offering some discussion points will give people some time to think of their questions. So I noticed that actually all of the papers connected quite well. All of the papers in various ways. I mean, the panel's titled Regional Powers, but in many ways it was regional powers and the issue of polarity from a systemic point of view and how it actually interacts with ideas, right? So ideologies, perceptions, we also had values as mentioned. So it's really how all of the papers are considering the ways in which those ideas intervene, interact with the systemic factors, right? The, sort of the material constraints. And so that was all of the papers very balanced in that sense. And so I think some of them actually spoke quite well to each other. So Umer, with your paper, where you're looking at the balancing and ideological balancing as well between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, I think you paid quite good attention to the fact that it's a mixture of systemic and agential factors, right? You didn't leave out the role of the decision makers, which can sometimes happen when we're talking about balancing of polarity. So that was really helpful. I wonder, and these aren't sort of questions to pick at what you've said, but just additional things to perhaps reflect on or clarify. I mean, to what extent are, if we're talking about a bilateral situation like with Turkey and Saudi Arabia here, it's not just the intervention and the role of global hegemons like the United States, but thinking about James's paper, there might be unpredictable factors, there might be other rivals, global rivals against the United States in this case, which don't really fit into the norm, right, or the existing pattern of polarity, and how does that disrupt the ideological calculations of, for example, these two states in particular. So it's not just having to consider each other's sort of next ideological moves, but what about these other interventions that don't actually fit the norm, right? And so what kind of impact does that disruption have on a pattern of ideological and systemic interaction between those states, right? So is it, because at one point at the end of your presentation you're mentioning that, well, the decision lies very much with the leaders, but actually is that placing too much agency with those decision makers when there's still a lot in the control of other actors? And just to go to, I'll come to Aidan's paper in a bit, but because I think there are some interesting connections with James's paper. I mean, James, yours was really situating the Middle East and all of its dynamics within a much greater global context, which I think is really necessary, especially in, it's not just, we're not just seeing a multipolar situation in the Middle East, but we're actually seeing real shifting dynamics on a global level. So it's necessary to consider, for example, the role of China, the role of almost every Middle East scholar is already aware of the increased role of Russia, but I think recognizing the role that China has to play is really important. And you did mention that it's not just about balancing their power interests, but there's a balancing of shared values. And here I want to bring in Aidan's paper. Well, actually, we're talking about values in Aidan, really rich theoretical grounding to your paper, which is really, really interesting. I wonder if both for yours and James's paper, when we're talking about values or we're talking about, in your paper, hegemony. I'm thinking about Julian Goh's work on empire, particularly his 2011 book on patterns of empire. where he switches the word hegemony for imperialism. And if we're talking about the Middle East, actually, is it helpful that we switch this term, which has got quite realist connotation? It doesn't have to, but we switch it with imperialism. So actually, imperialism is bound up in both a material dynamic, territorial dynamic, a military dynamic, but also there are strong ideological components to it. There are even racial components to it. And actually, if we switch some of these terms that we're using for imperialism, does that capture everything that we're trying to consider here without necessarily having to do the balancing between the material side of things and the ideological side of things? And I wonder if imperialism might be a good swap for hegemony. I mean, Julian Go does switch hegemony for imperialism in his work, and it seemed to me that it might work with your paper as well, which explains some of those hierarchical factors that you're talking about too. And finally, because it came last in the order, Dylan's paper, I mean, I'm really sympathetic to how ideology plays into regional dynamics, but not just from a top-down perspective, but from the bottom up as well, like cooperative militias, and how they can sway things as well at the ground level, but also decision-making at the high level. This kind of fitted in a bit with some of the points that Umer was making with regards to bureaucratic politics having an impact, or the interference of ideology from that level. I wonder though, when you're talking about the temporary ideological alliances, one of this is something that I face sometimes in my work as well. So I'm wondering if a question could be asked of your categorization here is, why do they have to be ideological alliances? Why can we not just consider them to be tactical alliances, especially because they are temporary, and they might seem to fit within ideological binaries, but to what extent is this just historical determinism, so that some of these actors, they sort of occupy a certain space in the conflict, and then they become useful allies in a very particular phase, which then becomes obsolete further down the line? So are these really temporary ideological alliances, or just tactical? So I think I will finish with my reflections there, and you don't have to answer any of those points. They were just things to consider. So let me see if we have some questions. We do. So I see we have some of our organizers have asked a question. So we've agreed that we'll go to those who are non-organizing audience members first. So Simon, I'll come to you. Very helpful question in a bit. I can see that Mahdi has asked a question. Mahdi, do you want to ask it? You can take your microphone off mute, and if you'd prefer, I can ask it for you. Okay, I think that's in the interest of time. I'll just ask it. So 2 comments on Dylan's presentation. So Mahdi said he likes a presentation, especially concerning the historical background on Hezbollah's emergence. So Mahdi actually works on Hezbollah, that's his specialization. He suggests it's worth looking at other groups other than the Islamic Amal. For example, the group that was in Iraq and came back to Lebanon was part of Al-Dawah, of the Al-Dawah party. And in addition to that group, inspired by Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, so he's suggesting that you consider some other groups. And then he makes another point about Israel, and is the idea that Israel perceived Lebanon as a Christian country. And Mahdi suggests that Israeli motives in Lebanon was to defeat the PLO, and that their secondary goal was to bring in Jamal to power. So that's Mahdi's question. Let me ask Simon's as well. Or unless Simon, you want to actually come in and say your question? That's a no, right. So he's given a thanks to everyone. The first question is for Aidan. He asks Aidan to elaborate a bit more on your ideas of regional structure, especially in terms of the interaction of material and ideational powers. So Aidan, you mentioned the realist constructivism, which could be interesting. So I suppose Simon would like to elaborate on that. And B, could you elaborate on the hierarchies of structures? And then Simon has a question for you, James. Can you share a bit more about the failure of Saudi-Iranian dialogue in late 2019? What is stopping Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, from opening dialogue? So we have about 3 questions, I guess, for our panelists to consider. So why don't we start with Dylan?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the questions and thank you for the commentary. So I'll take the last first. So yeah, Al-Dawa and Fadlallah is definitely a great point. I had to sort of cut down what I was going to talk about. So I kept it to sort of to Islamic Amal, but yeah, I could definitely expand on that in the paper. And so thank you for that. In terms of what Israel's real motives were, yes, I mean defeating the PLO was definitely primary, but I think that the changing structure of politics in Lebanon because of the PLO's military power also changed, you know, the Lebanese forces perception of their own security and perception of their own identity, right? So they saw Lebanon's changing as the PLO rose in power and their, you know, relatively their power shrunk. So that's why I think the Lebanese forces sought a revisionist policy to revise the PLO's status. In terms of Israel, yeah, I mean, Israel wanted to defeat the PLO for sure, to eradicate the PLO, but they were also had their eye on the longer term game as well. So once the PLO had been defeated, then what? What would be established afterwards to secure Israel's northern border against future attacks? And I think that this is really where their sort of vision or their perception of Lebanon as being a Christian state, where they sort of saw themselves in Lebanon, right? They wanted to develop a sort of Christian Zionist state in Lebanon that then would sign a peace treaty with Israel. So, but thank you. Those are great questions.
James, do you want to answer the questions that were put to you?
Jasmine, I think James's connection dropped from the panel.
That's a shame. Maybe we'll get him
Yeah.
back in a second. Aidan.
Yep, sorry. Thanks for the questions. They're really thought-provoking. On the issue of regional structure and the interaction between materially and ideational factors, I would say that hierarchies of structures overlap between global polarities and regional polarities. And I think the risk of perceptual factors affecting the way that these orders are negotiated multiplies because of this new interaction between 2 previously separate orders, which are now interwoven by a modernity which is decentered. On the issue of multipolarity, I think that the issue with multipolarity as a term is that it can be constructed as a discursive trope that addresses the material dimensions between states and also critiques the civilizational ideology of US liberal hegemony. So Russia can use this very well as sort of a Gramscian common sense term just to critique basically everything about it. But both polarities or both ideologies that were dominant during the Cold War ignore class equality. Which is interesting because Farnah Haddad's book on sectarianism would actually point to the importance of this variable. So I would suggest or hypothesize that polarity in the region is somewhat exceptional. If you look at the work of Al-Sadr and his book, Our Philosophy During the Cold War, he kind of alludes to this critique that both the ideologies of the Cold War lacked some sort of moral center. So the polarity that I'm presenting of power in the Middle East through transnational Islam might look to rectify this moral center and offer a third way of polarity. And also on the point of Julian Goh's book, I agree that is a good book, and it's true that imperialism could be considered a form of hegemony. I question the applicability to the region just because this sort of the emergent movement or the emergent hegemonic force that I see in the system will not be state-based, and it may be imperial, but only in the sense that every revolutionary force takes a form of elite hegemonic structure once it gains power. It goes to the idea of revolutions and the way that they morph over time. But thanks for the thought-provoking questions.
Brilliant, thank you. Omar, I know that you had some comments off the back of the reflections.
Sure. Thank you for actually a very wonderful, couple of wonderful points. The first point I think you made was how does the international actors play into all of this? How do they impact ideational or systemic balancing? And I think the external field more or less plays into the structural environment and shapes the structural preferences of a particular actor. But for me to take them, you can say, in a more potent manner, I would see what is the sort of threat coming from that external actor, or impact on a prevalent threat, or impact on a prevalent security arrangement. So only in that manner we can actually weigh that external actor or a group of external actors overall contribution towards the anarchic field, because eventually they will influence or they will impress upon themselves on the structure. Of course, the impact can be ideational, the impact can be rather structural, and that's why the type of ruling regime, or the type of or the individual personality of the ruler, or the system of governance, they all are very important. And within Haas, he has done it really well, but he fixates it on to the governance system. That's why I try to give additional value to the personal agency of the ruler itself, which can interpret things differently or frame things differently from the domestic decision making or the domestic political structure itself. So that's why maybe the Turkish president, he framed Mohammed bin Salman differently than his father, King Salman, or the Qatari Emir framed Mohammed bin Salman differently from his cousin and previous Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif. The second question is actually very interesting. Why can't be these just simple these tactical alliances between actors and not long-term ideational alliances, long-term alliances which are meant to achieve some broader balancing? I think that's where it's very important, this index of structural congruity and ideational or ideological ideological multipolarity. If the net power of any one or even both of these variables is less, then we will see more tactical sort of arrangements between powers, and tactical forms of alliances or partnerships, and even tactical ways of you can say friction. And but I would argue that the one of these variables, either the multipolarity one or the structural congruity one, they cannot remain in a low power situation. So one would eventually become dominant and drive along the system and will impact will be impacting the frame of reference of the decision makers. So maybe I am more of a realist from my theoretical background, so I tend to go towards this direction. But I would say that any tactical alliances, they would be fragile and would eventually give way to some long-term rather friction or alignment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Omar. It's a very thorough answer. And we have a question from Anna Ballesteros from Barcelona Center of International Affairs, and she's following up on Simon's earlier question. And she asks, or she comments, Saudi-Iranian dialogue. With Saudi-Iranian dialogue, there was a good deal of could mediate. Apparently Imran Khan offered and did mediate. Is there a country with enough leverage to mediate between them? And what could that country be? So I guess that's directed to Omar. I don't know if James is back, but anyone can also tap it based on some of the theoretical underpinnings of your research, I guess.
Sure. I can also answer because I'm a Pakistani and a Pakistani Prime Minister has been mentioned. I think that what I have seen in my research, the Saudi side, at least they may eventually come to some sort of a detente with Iran, but they don't really see an opportunity for a rapprochement, if we may want to use that word. But they also see that the threat from Iran is a more realistic one and not an ideological one. So the Iranian threat is there to Saudi Arabia, is there to its infrastructure, it's there to is a more physical threat rather than an ideological threat. And the typical nature of the fifth columnists of Saudi Shias, specifically in the Eastern Province, is perhaps it's no longer as such. So regarding mediation, I think I would say Russia and China, they probably would be the best possible actors who are situated to do any sort of mediation, or who would really like to have mediation work. Otherwise, and I think they have the political weight within both Saudi Arabia and Iran to move both sides. But apparently, and I am quite sure both sides would have tried in a way to achieve this, but it seems that on both the Iranian side and Saudi side, there is not much appetite to improve relationship, particularly in a more regional security process, or in a regional security order where you don't have USA or other European powers playing any role anymore. And from the Iranian perspective, I think they would be very sensitive about their political space, which they have made within Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, and would always remain very cautious about any attempts by Saudi Arabia particularly to either encroach upon that space or to limit that space, specifically as now we are seeing another sort of such episode happening in Iraq. So I think the distrust, it runs quite deep within both sides, and on both sides you can also say that the hawks, they are controlling policy making towards each other. But probably both sides have also learned that an outright conflict is not in their own interest, and they rather need to focus on bigger threats. For Iran, of course, the bigger threat probably is economic, as well as more related with retaining its strategic space within the region. For Saudi Arabia, the threat perception now seems to have turned more towards its sort of ideological foes, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you see the coverage within Saudi media outlets, clearly they rate Turkey as a much higher or much bigger threat, or as a bigger boogeyman, of course, alongside Qatar, than Iran. These are some of the trends which are visible. So I don't see any active mediation happening. There must be actors very happy to do it, but unless both sides don't want to move it any further, nobody can really achieve anything. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Umer. Does anyone have? Yeah. Anna agrees with you, and thanks you. If anyone has any another question, feel free to put it in the chat box. Can I ask also if when the panelists are answering, please also switch your video on. This prevents everyone having to look at me and sort of blank screen. All right. Any further questions? Simon disagrees slightly, which is good. It's always good to have different perspectives. And yeah, please feel free to follow up with the panelists even after the panel's over to discuss any of these issues. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I think there was a question that was sent to me to Dylan, actually. It was a question for Dylan about the impact of forthcoming annexation. I think that's from the Israeli context. So maybe Dylan wants to speak to that.
Hi. Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't really thought about it. So I don't have any good thoughts on it. I mean, I'd have to think about it. Sorry, that's a very unsatisfactory answer, but I'd have to think about it.
Okay. No, I don't think thinking about things is unsatisfactory at all. It's a good idea. There's not enough thought going on in the world, right? And there will be, that's correct. There's going to be a panel on the Israeli-Palestinian context and a lot more on the annexation this afternoon, so at 2 p.m. So if people are interested in that, definitely tune in for that panel. I'll give people some time to think of their questions. Sure. Aidan, I think, wants to come in with the point on polarity and Iranian history. So go ahead, Aidan, please do switch your camera on.
Thanks, Jasmine. And thanks for all the thought-provoking questions and discussions. It's definitely given everyone a lot to think about. Just on this point of thinking about polarity in a grand historic sort of way and looking back in the past. And I might make the point that when we think about Iran and the way that Iran conducts itself in the regional system, we have to remember that the time and space between the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the period today is no longer than when the Wright brothers flew the first plane and the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb. So that tells us something about the changes of time and continuity and how a lot of the ways that these states conduct statecraft in the region has been constrained by forces outside the region. So I think the way that these states interact with each other moving forward will be a lot more deterministic than in the past, but we also are very imperiled in making predictions about the future because of the relative nascency of these states and how their ideologies and identities are still aligning with their national identities.
Great, thank you for that comment, Aidan. And I think we have James back. And since James didn't have a chance to answer the questions that were put to him before, I'll just repeat, I think it was Simon's question, where, this is for James, he asked, can you share a bit more about the failure of Saudi-Iranian dialogue in late 2019? What is stopping Saudi Arabia, i.e. Mohammed bin Salman, from opening dialogue?
Well, I think what you had at the time was essentially the aftermath of basically the attacks on the tankers off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, the attacks on Saudi oil facility, and the failure to of the U.S. to respond to those, or at least not respond to them for quite a bit of time. And as a result, these were, for a brief moment in my mind, open to some sort of, not mediation necessarily, but in any case, an exchange of messages indirectly, primarily using the good offices of the Iraqis. And in fact, if you go back to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, he was arriving in Baghdad carrying a message from the Iranians to the Saudis that was going to be conveyed to the then Iraqi prime minister and onwards to the Saudis. So I'm not quite sure how serious an attempt it was. And I think that if you look at the, just generally over the last 5 years that Mohammed bin Salman has been in power, his approach towards Iran has been a hard line. He had seriously an opportunity with the pandemic, and he didn't take it up, even though it was suggested to him on various occasions. Hello?
Thanks, thank you, James. Thank you for that answer. Sorry, just had a technical issue.
No worries.
Great. So I think if we don't have any further questions.
I wanted to make a couple of comments on Dylan's presentation.
Of course, yeah, please go ahead. Of course, yeah.
And I would, with all due respect, I would take issue with a number of things, and I do that having witnessed all of these events and spoken to the players as they unfolded. I don't think that the Israelis ever perceived Lebanon as a Christian country. What they perceived was basically going back to a philosophy developed by Ben Gurion, that if you can't have relations with your neighbors, you have relations with your neighbors' neighbors. In this case, it was the Christians that for good reason, that the Israelis felt that they could do business with, even though there was a significant, if not a majority, of a Muslim population in Lebanon. And what they did, rather than not recognize that there were Muslims there, they overestimated the power of the Maronites and of the Kataeb and the Lebanese forces and so on. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, the other two things is that with regard to the way the Iranians perceive themselves and the way that their self-understanding, you had a major change in Iranian perceptions of themselves with the Iran-Iraq war. So running up to the war, the first year and something of the revolution, it was revolutionary zeal. You would go to Montazeri's Diwan and spend hours with the Islamic Liberation Front of Bahrain, and so on. What changed with the Iran-Iraq war was two things. One was you had the rise of Iranian nationalism, and that increasingly took the place of the revolutionary zeal, even though the facade of of revolutionary zeal was kept up. And you had what was certainly the beginning of call it a covert, whatever you want to call it, Saudi-Iranian war that's been going on for 40 years. Don't forget that the Iraqis were funded by the Gulf states, not only Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia very heavily, and that the whole Saudi soft power religious campaign since then was focused on Iran. And I think that those are factors that you need to factor in, and they also, to some degree, explain what Iran's tactic and strategy is, both in military and defense terms, to its proxies or its allies in various parts of the Middle East. The question is, and I think, I don't know, I know the answer, but I think it's a question one has to pose: what happens if indeed you come to some sort of understanding in the region, in which, for example, you have an aggression path, or you have a revised security architecture that, without question, will change the relationship between Iran and various groups, whether that's Hezbollah, whether that's various Iraqi militias, whether that's the Houthis, whoever that may be.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, James. And we have just time for just one more question. And then we'll wrap up. This one's from Chris Phillips. And I'll just read out his question. So thanks to everyone. Fascinating presentations. I have a question for Umer. So he said it's a really interesting paper, but he's always questioned one of the core assumptions of Gauss's underbalancing thesis. The idea that Turkey does see Iran as a threat and that it should balance against it. And Chris is saying that he's not sure this is actually the case. And he thinks there's a strong argument that within regional politics, Turkey is a third pole. So rather than an offshoot of what Gauss calls a Sunni camp. And moreover, that it's not new. Iran-Turkey relations have rarely been confrontational either before or after 1979. What is new is Turkey's involvement in wider Middle East regional politics. Indeed, arguably, it is this Turkish entry into MENA regional politics that has contributed to the region being multipolar rather than bipolar. In this sense, I'm not sure that a change in leadership in Turkey would change this. So in the last few minutes, Umer, if you could respond to
Thank you. I think it's a very good point, especially about the relationship between Turkey and Iran not being essentially confrontationalist. I kind of partially agree, and that's why I am trying to really deconstruct this notion of why even trying to understand underbalancing, but also trying to deconstruct what Haas and Gauss have mentioned, that it's Turkey and Saudi failure to align themselves against Iran. I think there are a couple of things which can be added upon here, especially the Kurdish question between Turkey and Iran as a factor which has the potential to complicate ties. Of course, the Syria factor was not there before, but then it came along within the relationship, specifically after Turkey became heavily involved within the Middle East. So, but still, I go more or less with your point that we really have to see how much Turkey can be dependent upon by other powers as a balancing actor against Iran. But on the other hand, I would not agree that the Turkish notion of a separate pole will continue now, because if you see the ideological divide within Turkey, the current government, it represents a very different notion of Turkish political sphere, and we can see within the broader Muslim world that Turkey is actively hitting upon and eyeing the space which Saudi Arabia has had for like 40 odd years now as the undisputed sort of leader of broader Muslim world. a Muslim world which was more religious, not the Muslim world which had socialist tendencies or nationalist leaders in charge. And now Turkey is going for the very same constituency, particularly non-Arab Muslim nations. I guess the Arab sphere, Saudi Arabia is holding quite well for now. But the non-Arab Muslim world sphere, which has, I would say, more religious tendencies and lesser the sort of course, they don't have that pan-Arab sort of tendencies. So I really see a friction and sort of a contestation for political space happening between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And if there is a different power, different government in Turkey, which is ideologically on a different plane, I would say that that would really have an impact on the nature of Saudi-Turkey relationship, but also the nature of this power contestation within the broader Muslim world. Because if a new government comes in, specifically a more secular inclined one, and then they think that their neighborhood is Europe rather than Middle East, so then you will eventually see the impact within the Middle East. But for now, any new government, which I don't think there would be within the next 4 or 5 years, they would have to engage within the Middle East and have to either continue or revisit the policy which is there. So yeah, that's my answer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Umer. And that will be the last question and answer that we have. I just want to thank everybody for, first of all, the panelists, really interesting presentations. And I think actually there's quite, I can see in the private chats, there's quite a lot of interesting interactions, and I think it would be a good idea for all of you to be in touch and continue this conversation. And also a big thank you to all of the audience and for some really interesting questions. And again, I'm sure you can follow up with the panelists if you had questions that we didn't have time for. The next panel will start at 11:15, so you have, if you're planning to attend that, and I definitely would recommend that you do, you have 15 minutes. It's titled Theoretical Reflections on Politics and International Relations in the Middle East, and that will be chaired by Eddie Wasnich. So thank you, everyone, and fantastic questions.